Hey, it's Tanya here at Nerdy Knitting. Today we're talking about binding off in pattern. We'll find out what that means and how to bind off in seed stitch and a special bind off for knit 2 purl 2 rib that gives it a little bit more stretch. If you want to jump to a specific topic, check out the timestamp links in the video description box down below. So what does binding off in pattern mean? All it means is that you're continuing the pattern by either knitting or purling the stitch as you bind it off. So if I were to bind off in stockinette, I would knit my stitches and bind them off as I worked across the row. If I were binding off in reverse stockinette, I would purl the stitches and bind them off as I worked across the row. The same goes for garter. Garter stitches knit every row, so I would knit, and as I knit, I would bind them off. Now, what about seed stitch? This one is pretty interesting because it's a knit 1 purl 1 pattern, but it changes on every row. So my first stitch here is a knit stitch, that little V right there, followed by a purl stitch. So if I knit this and then bound it off, I'd have another knit stitch above this knit stitch, and I don't want that. To bind off in seed stitch, I want to continue that pattern, which means if I see a knit stitch, I purl it. If I see a purl stitch, I knit it. So that's what I do while I bind off. Let's bind off this row. You're still going to do the basic bind off. There is knit stitch first, so I'll purl it, which means I work the first 2 stitches. And there is a purl stitch, so I'm going to knit it. So I've got my 2 stitches. I'm going to pull that first stitch right over the second one. And that first stitch is bound off. That's all there is to it. But to bind off in pattern, you follow the pattern set. And for seed stitch, that means it's a knit stitch. I need to purl it. So I purl that stitch, bind one off. My next stitch is a purl stitch. In seed stitch, that means I need to knit. Bind it off. And that's all there is to it. Binding off in pattern just means follow the pattern set. This can seem confusing at first, but once you understand how it works, it really isn't. So I'm going to finish binding off my row. There you go, 3 stitches left. That's a purl, so in seed stitch that means I knit it. Bind it off. Work a purl. Bind it off. I think you can knit with confidence, but it all starts with understanding your knitting and how the stitches work together. And binding off in pattern. There we go, there's our last one. Doesn't have to be difficult, even for seed stitch, which can sometimes feel a bit complicated. We cut our yarn. All we need to do is hold that there and pull it right through. And there we go. We bound off in pattern. We continued that seed stitch pattern right there, right to the top of the bind off row. Now let's bind off our rib pattern. When you have rib pattern, you generally want a stretchy bind off. So we're going to use the basic bind off with a slight change. Now the first thing we're going to do, we're going to bind off in pattern. That means I'm going to knit a stitch or purl a stitch as it presents as I'm binding it off. I'm not going to just knit across the row. We'll do our first 2 normally. Knit the first 2 stitches. Bind off that first stitch. Now, after this, we're going to do this a little bit differently. You're going to purl, the next stitch is a purl stitch, so I'm going to purl it, but I'm not going to drop it off the needles. I'm going to leave it there, and I'm going to pull some slack out because it's that top, that bind off at the top. We want that to be loose. So that these stitches are going to be looser there, and now I've dropped that stitch off. Let's repeat that. Keeping that on the needle makes you pull out more yarn to bind off, and that gives you a slightly stretchier bind off. Bind off that stitch, dropping that stitch off now. Okay, the next stitch is a knit stitch, so I will knit it, but I'm going to leave it on the needle for now while I go over and bind off another stitch. And once I've bound it off, I will drop that stitch off. And you can see that's giving us a little more stretch than a basic bind off would. We're making these stitches just a little bit bigger than they normally would be. Knit, but leave it on there. Bind it off. Next one's a purl. Leave the stitch on there as we bind it off. And now we can drop it off. That's all there is to it. You just leave that stitch there, and that causes you to pull up extra slack in that bind off stitch. Bind it off and drop that stitch off. Here, so I will finish working the row and then show you how this looks. And there you go. I finished the last stitch. All we need to do is cut our yarn, pull that final loop through, and we have a bind off that is stretchy. If you like to get a bit nerdy with your knitting, click the subscribe button down below.